There are essentially three different movements that come together in the Colloque des Intellectuels Juifs de langue française. So those three movements are the Strasbourg School, which André Neher is essentially the leader of, the École d'Orsay, which was started by Robert Gamzon, who was the leader of the Jewish Scout movement, and there's Levinas's school, which was the École Normale Israélite Orientale. Called ENIO, basically. And so these are sort of three different centers of revival. And these three centers, each of their leaders, in some sense, comes to participate in the colloque. So when I refer to this movement, in some sense, I'm referring to all three, and I'm also referring to what happens when they coalesce into this one, or it's not even one, it's a series of meetings, kind of biannual meetings. Among those leaders, there's a predominant sentiment that one needs to rethink the kind of bargain of emancipation. Sort of the fundamental bargain of Jewish emancipation was that Jews would give up national belonging in order to have a Judaism that was a confession. In the post-war period, there is a sense not that one wants to give up on that religious piece, but that one wants to give up on the sense in which the values of the West or philosophy or French politics, depending on which venue you're having this conversation, that these institutions, let's put it, should be the arbiter of value. The claim is that the Jewish tradition should now be the arbiter of value. And the answer as to why they should be, in some sense, is a consequence of their being the victims of the worst atrocity in European history, and being the victims, in some sense, being exempt from what went wrong to have created the atrocity. Once you have the State of Israel and you have a community that wants to stay in diaspora, what is the worth and value of diaspora? And so I think they're trying to answer the question, what is the worth and value of diaspora, by saying what we have to offer is this spiritual tradition. So they're having these conversations with Israeli ambassadors who are coming to their community and arguing that they should make Aliyah, and they want to make a claim that their own tradition has its own resources. So they're staking a claim over and against this argument that there must be a full ingathering of Jews to the land of Israel. On the other hand, they have understood themselves as a community, as a religious community, and what they think is valuable about Judaism are its religious values. When they read what's happening in Israel, when you hear them talk about it or when they write about it, they say, oh, these young people, they're all so tan, they're all so healthy, they're dancing, and there's a kind of admiration for that, especially because many of the people who are part of the French Jewish community they're refugees, and many of them are sickly, and they're essentially and they're orphans. And so there's this contrast between this one community and the other. And they want to argue that there is something in what it means to hold on to the rituals, to read the text, and to find in the text answers to these, what are really philosophical and theological questions that is the heart of Judaism. And they don't see the focus on those things in Israel. The claim that I make is that already during the war, there is a desire to read the suffering of the Jews and the persecution of the Jews as a part of the Jewish story of suffering and persecution. And that suffering becomes a way to align themselves with the Israelites that they read about in Torah, or to think about what happened after the first and the second exile, the first and the second destruction of the temple. That becomes the center of their sort of sense of religious identity, that sense of identification. And along with that come ways of reading Torah such that there is a sense in what it means to read Genesis is to read it as a story about the Jewish people. And always about the Jewish people. It was about the Jewish people, it's still about the Jewish people. And so the story, the unfolding story of the Jews is still being told in these texts. So that merges essentially with the movement of religious Zionism, which has its origin in Rav Kook and then in Rav Tzvi Kook. And so they find, a few of them, I wouldn't say this of all of them, they find, so of Ashkenazi in particular, we can say it, and André Neher as well, that they find in this movement a similar way of reading Torah, but its end is no longer just in suffering. Its end is now in the experience of deliverance, and that deliverance is the return of the Jews to the land of Israel. One of the arguments that I'm making is that one of the things that unites the movement from its beginning to its end, and this is a claim that André Hare makes, it's a claim that Ashkenazi makes, it's a claim to continuity within Jewish thought, particularly within French Jewish thought, is the claim that they're all the way through, there's a universalism to this kind of thinking. This is not ethnic particularism. So how do you get away from talking about Zionism as a nationalism? How do you understand that as a universalism? And the way you do is you go back to this idea that you go back to the idea of tikkun olam in some sense. You go back to the idea that like what it means to do the mitzvot in the world, so this Kabbalistic notion is to heal the world, and that Jews are essentially the handmaidens or the handmaids of that work, that their work is to suffer to heal the world. That means that, and Herman Cohen says, happiness isn't for the Jewish people, and they're exemplary of a possibility of community life that isn't focused on happiness, but focused on goodness. So you go back to that story, and then the question is, how do you tell that same story as the story of the return to the Jews, the land of Israel? And you can tell that story when you understand what it means to have this election. What that means is not just a kind of historical political story, it's also a metaphysical story, because this election is about the land which is holy and this people that are holy, and when you put the land and the people together that are holy, you have a cosmic transformation. And if you claim that the Jews stand at the center of that, then what is good for the Jews in some sense is good for the world. It's a healing of the world.